He never told anyone what he did that morning. That was just the kind of man he was. It was a Tuesday in February, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It just arrives, settles into your coat collar, finds the gap between your glove and your sleeve, and stays there. Chicago was gray from the sidewalks up. The kind of gray that makes you feel like the sky gave up somewhere over Michigan and just coasted the rest of the way in. Jonah Pruett was 41 years old, and he was carrying a mop bucket toward the service elevator on the 4th floor of Mercy Cross Hospital when he heard it. A woman crying, not loud, the kind of crying people do when they're trying not to be heard. He stopped walking. Room 412 had its door cracked about 3 inches, enough to hear, not enough to see. Jonah stood with one hand on the mop handle, water slowly draining off the gray strings onto the linoleum, and he listened for a moment the way you do when you're not sure if something is your business. It wasn't his business. He knew that. He pushed the door open anyway. The room had 2 beds. One was empty and stripped bare. The other held a woman who looked to be somewhere in her 70s. Thin white hair, reading glasses sitting sideways on her face because she'd been crying too hard to straighten them. She was holding a cell phone in both hands like it was something fragile, looking at the screen the way people look at something they wish they hadn't seen. On the tray table next to her, a half-eaten cup of hospital Jell-O, a water pitcher with no cup, and a printed form with the words Insurance Coverage Denied stamped across the top in red. Jonah had seen that form before. Not his mother's, 16 years ago. "Ma'am," he said, "you need something?" She looked up. Her eyes did the thing eyes do when they've been crying long enough. That reddened, slightly startled look, like she'd forgotten for a moment that other people existed in the world. She looked at his scrubs, at the mop bucket, at his face. "No," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and started to pull the door back. "My daughter was supposed to come," the woman said, to no one in particular. "She said she was coming yesterday. She hasn't answered since." Jonah let go of the door. He pulled the single chair in the room closer to her bed and sat down. He didn't ask permission. He didn't check if anyone was watching from the hallway. He just sat. "What's your name?" he asked. She blinked at him. "Aloy. Jonah," he said. "What's going on with the insurance?" Her name was Eloise Strant, and she had driven herself to the emergency room 6 days ago after her left arm went numb while she was making coffee. She'd had a minor stroke. She was lucky, the doctors said. She'd come in fast enough. The damage was minimal. But she needed observation. She needed medication management. She needed, according to the paperwork on her tray table, about $11,000 that her supplemental insurance had just decided it wasn't going to cover because of a pre-authorization clause she hadn't known existed. Her daughter, whose name was Barb, lived in Indianapolis. Barb had 2 kids under 5 and a husband who worked nights. Barb had said she was coming. Barb had not come. "She's got a lot going on," Eloise said. Not defending her, just stating it. "You got a social worker assigned?" Jonah asked. "Someone came by yesterday morning. Left a card. I don't know what she said. Where's the card?" Eloise looked around the tray table, pulled open the drawer below it, found the card under a get-well balloon someone had left deflated. She handed it to him. He looked at it, turned it over. "I know her," he said. "The social worker. Her name's Patrice. She's good. She actually picks up her phone." He set the card back on the tray. "What time did they say discharge would be?" "They said maybe Thursday. That's 2 days. You got somewhere to go Thursday?" Eloise was quiet for a moment. "My apartment," she said. "3rd floor. No elevator." Jonah looked at her left hand, which she was keeping very still in her lap. The stroke had been minor. The weakness was not. "All right," he said. He stood up, picked up the mop handle again. "I'll be back at lunch." She didn't say anything. She watched him go. He'd been a hospital custodian for 11 years. Before that, 9 years in the Army, Signal Corps, 2 deployments, one to Iraq and one to Afghanistan that nobody talks about anymore, because nobody was supposed to be there for as long as they were. He came back to Chicago because his mother was sick, and he was the only one who came back for things like that. His mother died 8 months after he got home. He got the job at Mercy Cross, 6 weeks after the funeral, because it was the first one that would take him without questions about the gap in his employment history. He was good at the job, not because mopping floors was complicated, but because he was the kind of person who could not do something halfway. His section of the hospital was the cleanest on the floor. He knew the names of the nurses, the preferences of the long-term patients, which doctors wanted the hallway clear when they were doing rounds, and which ones didn't care. He was quiet. He was precise. He was almost invisible, the way certain people become invisible when the system decides what box to put them in. He ate lunch alone, most days, at a table near the window in the basement cafeteria. That Tuesday, he ate his sandwich in about 4 minutes, took the stairs back up to 4, knocked on 412, and went in. Eloise was awake. She'd straightened her glasses. He'd made 3 calls during his 30-minute break. One to Patrice, whose voicemail he left a specific message on. Not vague, not please help this woman, but her room number, her discharge date, the name of the pre-authorization clause on her denial form, and a question about whether the hospital's charity care fund had been applied. One to a woman named Dana in patient billing, who owed him a favor because he'd found her left-behind wallet in the break room 2 years ago and put it in her hands before anyone else could. And one to a number he still had from his Army days. A veterans advocacy line that technically wasn't supposed to help non-veterans, but that Jonah had helped fundraise for 3 separate years running, and whose director picked up personally when she saw his name. "Someone's going to call you today," he told Eloise. "Her name is Patrice. You answer when she calls. You tell her everything you told me. Don't leave anything out because you think it's embarrassing or too much. She's heard worse, and she doesn't judge." Eloise was looking at him the way people look at something they can't quite fit into the shape they'd made for the world. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Because I've got the time right now," he said. "And because you're not going to be able to climb 3 flights of stairs Thursday with a weak left arm." "You don't know that." "I know the 4th floor stairwell better than any doctor in this building," he said. "And I know what a person looks like the day after a stroke when they think they're fine and they're not." She was quiet. "You got anyone who can stay with you?" "A neighbor, a friend. Doesn't have to be family." "There's a woman across the hall," Eloise said slowly. "We've had coffee a few times. I don't know if I'd call her a friend." "Call her anyway," Jonah said. "People will surprise you when you ask." He had to get back to his section. He told her he'd check in before end of shift. He did. Patrice had called. The call had lasted 47 minutes. Eloise had told him this with the look of someone who had been through a fire drill they weren't expecting, and come out the other side oddly grateful. There was a charity care application being processed. There was a potential financial assistance fund through the hospital foundation that Patrice thought Eloise might qualify for. There was, still, the matter of the stairs. "Barb called," Eloise said, when he was about to leave. He waited. "She's not coming." A pause. "Her husband's having some kind of thing at work. I don't know." Another pause, smaller. "I told her it was okay." "Was it?" Jonah didn't ask. "The woman across the hall," he said. "Did you call her?" "I couldn't remember her last name. I felt strange calling the building and asking for a Margot. Is her name Margot?" "I think so." "Call the building," he said. "Tell them exactly what you told me. That's all you have to do." She did, while he waited. He watched her make the call. He watched her voice get smaller and then stronger as the woman on the other end apparently said yes without hesitation. He watched Eloise's face do the thing faces do when they've been expecting no, and someone says yes. That involuntary moment where the eyes fill up again, not because things are bad, but because they just turned out, unexpectedly, to be okay. He left before she could say thank you. He had a floor to finish. 3 weeks passed. Jonah Pruett worked his shifts. He took the 8:15 Red Line north every morning and the 5:40 south every evening. He went to his apartment in Rogers Park, which had 3 rooms and 1 wall of bookshelves, that he'd built himself on a Saturday afternoon when he needed something to do with his hands. He called his sister in Milwaukee on Sundays. He ran 4 miles on Thursdays, slower in winter. along the lakefront where the wind came off the water like something personal. He had not thought much about Eloise Strand since she'd been discharged. He hoped the charity care had gone through. He hoped Margot across the hall was the kind of person who meant it when she said yes. He was thinking about none of this on a Thursday morning, when someone knocked on the door of the housekeeping supply closet on the 4th floor, which was where he'd been restocking cart shelves for the last 12 minutes. He opened it. The man standing in the hallway was somewhere in his early 60s, wearing a coat that Jonah recognized immediately as expensive without knowing exactly why. The cut of it, the way it sat on the man's shoulders, the absence of any visible wear. He was taller than Jonah by an inch or two. He had the kind of face that had been through a lot, and then had the years to make peace with it. Behind him, slightly to the left, stood a younger man in a suit, holding a portfolio and looking at his phone. "Jonah Pruett," the older man said. Jonah looked at him. "Yeah, I'm Gerald Strand," the man said. "Eloise is my mother." Gerald Strand was, as it turned out, the kind of person whose name you'd seen without registering it, in the business section of the Tribune, in the footnotes of articles about Chicago development, in the donor lists of about 6 institutions that Jonah walked past regularly and never thought much about. He'd started a logistics company in 1998 in a warehouse in Bridgeport, built it into something with operations in 11 states, sold it in 2019 for a number that Jonah would later read and find hard to make real in any concrete way. He'd moved to Phoenix afterward, which was where he'd been when his mother had her stroke, and where his phone had been on silent because he was in the middle of a board meeting for a foundation he'd started after the sale. He had landed at O'Hare 40 minutes after hearing his mother's voicemail. He'd gotten there the evening of her second day. He'd been in the building. He simply hadn't known that anything had needed doing, because by the time he arrived, someone had already done it. "The social worker," Gerald said, standing in the hallway outside the supply closet, "told my mother there was a man from housekeeping who'd started the whole process. Patrice. That was her name. She said it was the most specific referral message she'd ever gotten on her voicemail. She said she knew someone had actually read the paperwork." Jonah leaned against the doorframe. "The charity care go through, fully covered." Gerald paused. "She's home. She's doing physical therapy. Margot from across the hall drives her on Tuesdays." "Good. My mother told me you sat with her." Jonah shrugged slightly. "She said you came back on your lunch break. I had time." Gerald looked at him for a moment. Not the way people looked at him usually. Not the quick scan and category assignment. The eyes that moved from the scrubs to the mop cart and decided they had enough information. Gerald was looking at him the way you look at someone when you're trying to understand something that doesn't fit the shape you expected. "I want to ask you something," Gerald said, "and I'd like you to tell me the truth." Jonah waited. "How long have you been here?" 11 years. "What did you do before?" "Army, 9 years." "What did you do?" "In the Army. Signal Corps. Communications infrastructure. I managed a team of 12 by the end of my second deployment." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Have you ever applied for a position in hospital administration?" Jonah looked at him evenly. "I applied for a supervisor role in facilities management in 2019. I was told they were looking for candidates with a degree." "Do you have a degree?" "Associates. Working on the bachelor's. Nights and online." "In what?" "Healthcare administration." Another pause. "Why?" Gerald asked. Not dismissive. Genuinely asking. Jonah thought about it for a moment. Not the answer, which he knew, but whether to give it honestly to a stranger in an expensive coat. Then he decided that honesty was the only thing that had ever served him and gave it anyway. "Because I've spent 11 years watching how this building works from the inside. I know which systems fail patients and which ones don't. I know which discharge protocols lose people before they get to follow-up care. I know where the gaps are because I'm in the gaps every single day." He paused. "I applied for the supervisor role because I thought it was a step in that direction. They didn't see it that way." Gerald was quiet for a long time. The younger man behind him had stopped looking at his phone. "The foundation I run, Gerald said carefully. Funds a workforce development program for veterans and working adults transitioning into healthcare management. We've placed 11 people in hospital system roles in the last 3 years. He looked at Jonah. We've never placed anyone from within an existing hospital staff because no one's ever applied. He paused. That's an oversight. Jonah didn't say anything. I'm not offering you a job, Gerald said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not in a position to offer you anything that's mine to give. I don't own this hospital, but I know the people who run the system it's part of. I know the woman who chairs the board of the foundation that does their leadership pipeline. And I think, if you're willing, you should talk to her. Jonah looked at him for a long moment. Why? Because my mother told me something, Gerald said. She said when you walked out of her room that first day, she thought you were going to forget her the second you hit the hallway. And then you came back. He stopped. People who come back. There aren't as many as there should be. The conversation with the foundation director happened 6 weeks later in a conference room on the 22nd floor of a building on Michigan Avenue. Her name was Adrienne Voss, and she was the kind of person who had heard a lot of pitches and was very good at knowing which ones were real. She asked Jonah to walk her through a system he thought was failing patients. He talked for 22 minutes without notes. She asked 12 questions. He answered all of them directly, including 3 he didn't know the answer to, which he said plainly, because that was also the kind of man he was. He started the fellowship program 4 months later. 12 months after that, he was in a role he'd been told he wasn't qualified for. Not because Gerald Strand had made a phone call, though Gerald had made a phone call, but because a woman named Adrienne Voss had sat across a conference table and recognized someone who had spent 11 years learning a thing the hard way. He still sometimes took the stairs on the 4th floor, not because his new office was anywhere near 4. But because he knew those stairs in a way that mattered. There's a type of person who moves through the world quietly, not because they have nothing to say, but because no one has ever built the room where their voice carries. Jonah Pruett knew every broken thing about that building because he had been invisible inside it long enough to see clearly. He knew what Eloise needed because he had stood at his mother's hospital door 16 years ago and wished someone would come back. He had carried that morning with him all this time, the way people carry the things they never got, until the day he could give it to someone else. $1.90 won't change a life, but sometimes the person who decides to stop walking, that changes everything. What would you have done if you'd heard that crying behind the door?